Welcome to So Much Fun. I'm Colleen Murphy and I teach sewing. Most of my students are beginners. Not all, but most of them. And the biggest hurdle that I find with them is learning how to read a pattern. So today I thought I would go over the pattern instruction sheet so that we become completely familiar with what it tells us. I'm going to use a McCall's dress pattern, but what I'm telling you today could apply to most any commercial pattern. So we're going to start with the cover of the pattern envelope. I've selected McCall's 7948 as our pattern that we're going to read. And I think after we go through it, you'll have a much better idea of what you need to consider when you're following a pattern. This pattern is a dress pattern, and it has 4 choices or 4 different views. And on the main cover of the envelope, it's showing you here the photograph is view D, and over here to this side you have view B and C. Turn it over to the back of the envelope. This is where it's most of our information that we want to read before we purchase the pattern. On the flap of the envelope will give us the body measurement chart, and I know that I have mentioned before how important it is that you know your body measurements before you buy a pattern, because you have to know that in order to know how much fabric to buy, and also if you're going to have to make any adjustments. They give it by bust, waist, hip, and back waist length. And what back waist length means, measuring from that prominent bone that's at the base of your neck down to your waist. And that's an important measurement. I know because I'm long-waisted, and I always have to add to the bodice pattern piece because my back waist length will be longer than what the pattern is. Below that, they also give the same body measurement chart in Spanish and French. Going on down on the back of the envelope, they're going to tell you what fabrics they suggest for this pattern. You don't have to buy exactly the same fabrics that they suggest, but do select something that with this particular dress that would have a nice drape. I'm saying this because I'm not making dotted Swiss, or I'm not using linen or crepe. I'm going to use rayon, but it has a nice drape, and I think it'll work just fine for this pattern. Then the next thing is notions. It's not just fabric. Your pattern will require more than fabric. And in this pattern, you need one 1/2 inch button. And it doesn't say that it's for a specific view. So that means all 4 views will require a button. Next is B and C views. Those 2 views are sleeveless, so they need bias tape. But you also have the option of making your own bias tape. Probably as a beginner you're not going to do that, but you will need bias tape. Views B and D are going to use lace. Personally, I'm not going to put lace on my dress because of the fabric. I don't think it would be appropriate, but if you were going to do that, you would need 4 yards. Below that is the fabric yardage. And again, it's broken down by size and also the width of fabric. Fabric normally comes 45 or 60 inches wide. I say the exception to that is home decor fabric. That is usually 54 inches wide. But fabric for clothing is going to be either 45 or 60. So you'll notice that 45-inch width fabric, you require more fabric than you do for 60-inch width. And if you're a beginner, and based too on the type of fabric that you select, you might want to add an extra 1/4 of a yard just in case if there's something happens that you might need that extra fabric from what the pattern is saying you will need. Notice that there are asterisks following the numbers 45 and 60, and that's in reference to either NAP or directional print. In both of those cases, you have to make sure that your pattern pieces are going in the same direction. Now, students will say to me, I don't know what nap is. And then I reply that think about velvet or corduroy. Those are two fabrics that have a definite nap. So that when you run your hand across the fabric in one direction, it'll feel smooth. And then when you run your hand across in the opposite direction, it'll feel rough. So nap should be running down when you cut out a garment, but it does require a little bit of extra fabric. So the numbers that you see here, you want to follow according to your size. Now, if it turns out you're going to be using more than one size, let's say the hips are larger than what the pattern calls for, then you probably want to think about following the larger size when you're buying your fabric. Now, the next part of the pattern envelope that a lot of people miss, and it's right here where it says fusible interfacing, and it has it for all 4 views. And it says you need a 1/2 yard. And notice that it doesn't tell you whether it's lightweight, medium weight, heavyweight. It doesn't give you that information. It just says fusible interfacing. Now, your finished garment measurements, that's different, of course, than your body measurements. So you have to compare. Compare what you know to be your body measurements and look at the numbers for finished garment measurements and see right here where you would have to maybe change the size. Maybe you only need a size 12 for the bust, but you need a size 14 for the hip. So pay attention to what the finished garment measurements are. And where it says back length from base of neck, that's from your neck down to the hem of the garment. And again, it also gives it in French and Spanish. Now, on the side of the envelope, it shows the front and back view for all 4 views. So you can see what it looks like on the front side and the back side. Now, let's go to the instruction sheets and look at that. First thing I want you to notice is it tells you in the upper left corner how many pages you have. 1 of 3. So pay attention to that. And again, it gives you the pattern number and the brand name. And again, you have drawings. And this is, I believe these are the front views, not the back views. Oh yeah, here are the back views, right below it. Below the drawings of the different garments, it gives a drawing of all the pattern pieces that are in the envelope, and it has them numbered. So when you follow below that drawing, you're going to see that there is a list, and it indicates whether or not it's to be used for a specific view. And if there isn't a letter by the pattern piece name, then it means you're to use it for all 4 views. And that means like bodice front and bodice back, front neck facing, back neck facing. Those 4, no letters follow them, and that means they are to be used for all 4 views. When you get to number 5, you see that that is just for views A and B. And if you're going to have a pocket, that's for views A and B. So you can just follow along, and what I would suggest is to check off the pieces that you're going to need so that when you take your pattern sheets out of the envelope, you'll know which ones to find. But it also will give you there in the cutting layouts, that comes next, on how to lay the pattern pieces onto the fabric. And it lists that right below the view name. It says use pieces, and then it has how many they are or what they are. And again, it breaks it down by size and width of fabric. Again, 45-inch width, 60-inch width. And then this one says all sizes. And this one also says, no, this one doesn't. This has a range from size 6 to 16. So when you get to the cutting layouts, pay attention to what sizes they're saying that the cutting view is for. And we have it, they go by view. So they start out, here's view dress A, then it goes to dress B, and then it goes to dress C, and then we'll flip the paper over to page 2. and that should be for dress D. So they put them in alphabetical order. Below your cutting layouts, or after your cutting layouts, then, and also I should back up here, it even gives you a cutting layout for your fusible interfacing. I don't follow that exact, but it is here for people who like to follow it the way that the pattern shows them. You'll find out as you gain sewing experience, you will feel more comfortable with making variations from what the pattern shows. Now, your sewing information key is important. It's showing you that when you're reading the instructions and you see that the outline is in the dark gray, that represents the right side of the fabric. And then when it's clear, that's the wrong side of the fabric. The interfacing will have dots on it. If there's lining, there'll be little lines going through it on the right side of the lining. And then the wrong side of the lining will have those little lines, but it will not have any color. Then it tells you what your seam allowance is to be. And the standard seam allowance for clothing is 5/8 of an inch. And it also shows you when you are, let's say, having curves, what you do, how you notch them, or you clip them, or you trim them. So it does have drawings there to help you know what to do when you are doing some trimming of your seams. The next thing is talking about pinning, how you are to pin right sides together, and the importance of pressing, why you want to do that. And then you have a glossary. And I have talked about glossaries. I've done some videos on the terminology that patterns will have. And each pattern is different. It's based on the garment you're making. So in this pattern, it talks about ease stitching right up here, ease stitching, and it tells you what that means. It gives you a definition. And then finishing, how you finish a seam. Well, we usually use a serger, so we don't follow what they're saying here. How do you gather? You doing 2 longs of basting stitches inside your 5/8 inch seam allowance. Making a narrow hem. Slip stitching would be done with a hand sewing needle. Top stitching, of course, is stitching that's on top that you would see. And under stitching is for stitches that are underneath. And I do have videos demonstrating under stitching, top stitching. Let me see, do I have the ease stitching? I think I do. So you might want to look at those. They're very brief, and they'll give you a demonstration. Next, your sewing directions, telling us step-by-step what to do. And I always tell students when you're starting out, take it one step at a time, one sentence at a time. Because if you start reading, sometimes as a beginner, you can get overwhelmed. So I do think, though, with these patterns today, you have multiple views. And what I find can happen is you can be reading along, going step by step, and then discover that you're on the wrong view. So it is good to kind of do an overview and look to make sure that, like this says here, sewing directions for A, B, C, and D. That applies to all of them. And so you can follow that along. So right at this point on step number 7, this is for just views A and B. So if you're going to use the skirt of views C and D, you would want to skip that. And sometimes I will put an X on the pattern so that I don't pay any attention to that, so I don't keep reading it when I'm really not going to be doing that step. And then you can just kind of go all the way through the pattern and look for any steps that you might want to skip. Right here it says views B and D, and that has to do with the ruffle. So if you're doing A or C, you would not be doing that particular step. Now, let's go back to the very beginning. And it says, the very beginning, bodice. Notice it gives the pattern piece number in the drawing, 1 and 2. The front is 1 and the back is 2. And it shows the dark gray that represents the right side of the fabric. And then it has a broken line there showing you that's the seam line that they're referring to when it says stitch bodice front and bodice back together at shoulders. And also notice, you see how that thread is hanging out there, that you're going to sew, you should sew from the shoulder to the neck. Now, I just discovered in this drawing, it appears that they go from shoulder to neck and then from neck to shoulder. I disagree with that. I would go only from shoulder to neck, but the drawing is there. Now, the next step, on step number 2, it talks about the interfacing and having to have the interfacing on your facings. And notice how the pattern pieces have the little dots on there. And we saw that before, how the drawing shows you when the dots are there, that represents interfacing. So they're telling you to fuse that interfacing onto those 2 pattern pieces, number 3 and 4. And when you're doing this, if you read something and you don't understand what it says, then read it again. Now let's look at step 4. It says pin facing to neck edge, matching stitching lines. Now those stitching lines are on your pattern piece that you used to cut out your fabric. And if you need to go back and look at that pattern piece, this would be the back neck facing. That's what they're talking about. Look at that and you'll see where the stitching lines were and where the cutting line would be. It says to stitch along the seam lines and stitching lines. Take it one sentence at a time. If you don't understand it, you go back and you read it again. Look at the picture, read it again, look at the picture, and then when you feel like, well, maybe that's what I'm to do, then read the next sentence. I find that if you just keep reading, the more you read, the more confused you can get. So take it one sentence at a time. Pin facing to neck edge, matching stitching lines. That's pretty easy. Facing to the bodice of the dress. And then you're to sew along the seam lines, which is a 5/8 inseam. Now there's stitching lines on the back neck facing. That's what they're talking about. So once you stitch that, then they're telling you to cut. They use the word slash. Slash between stitching lines to lower small circle. That small circle is on the pattern, the paper pattern. Trim your neck edge. I prefer to grade. We're not going to get into that right now. And then the last sentence is understitching facing as far as possible. And if you don't know what understitching is, look up my video on understitching. But the important point that I want to make, one sentence at a time. Think about it. Look at the picture. Find the illustration that corresponds to the words. And in time, you will be able to follow what the pattern is saying. I'm not going to go through the entire instruction sheet because I think you get the idea of what you are to do. One step at a time, one sentence at a time. Don't jump around, because if you do, you're going to get confused. Just take it step by step. And always, before you even begin, make sure you have marked the steps that you're going to follow. Whichever view that you're using, you want to mark those steps. And as you complete each step, check it off. I tell everyone that it's a rare day that I have ever made anything from beginning to end without ever walking out of the sewing room. It may be days or weeks from the time you start a project before you finish the project. So when I have students who come on a weekly basis, I always say to them, where are we now? You check off the last thing you complete so that the next time you pick up the pattern, you know where you are. Be kind to yourself, and the more you do to help yourself, the better it is and the more enjoyable it will be for you. I hope the information I've shared with you today will help you when you are reading your pattern. If you have any questions and would like to get in touch with me, you're more than welcome. My email is SoMuchFun@twc.com. And be sure to subscribe and have so much fun.